From the standpoint of security analysts watching Russia's internal stability rather than its battlefield claims, the recent sequence of fires, outages, and infrastructure disruptions near and far from the capital has punctured a long-standing assumption that Moscow remains insulated from the consequences of the war, because for decades, the city functioned as the physical and symbolic core of state control, projecting the idea that whatever turbulence existed at the periphery would never reach the center. Yet imagery and reports circulating in recent weeks tell a more unsettling story in which industrial facilities ignite, power systems fail, and explanations arrive slowly, or not at all, prompting a reassessment of whether the strategy pursued by Vladimir Putin may have generated a form of retaliation that operates not through massed armies, but through selective disruption, particularly after Moscow escalated its campaign against Ukrainian energy infrastructure in an effort to grind civilian life into exhaustion, a tactic openly justified when the Russian leader appeared publicly in military attire and declared that the objectives of the so-called special military operation would be achieved through force rather than compromise, a declaration followed by sustained strikes intended to plunge Ukrainian cities into darkness and cold. Yet instead of producing capitulation, those attacks appear to have coincided with a pattern of incidents inside Russia that analysts say deserve closer scrutiny, because while officials have attributed each event to routine accidents, faulty wiring, or technical failures, the emerging geography suggests something more deliberate, beginning with a major industrial fire at a mineral fertilizer and chemical complex southeast of Moscow, a facility publicly described as agricultural, but privately understood by specialists as part of the industrial chain that supports ammunition production through outputs such as sulfuric acid, an input so foundational that its absence can slow or halt multiple downstream processes. And what drew attention was not merely the scale of the blaze, but reports indicating it originated in the sulfuric acid workshop itself, the most strategically sensitive unit on site, a detail that weakens the narrative of random malfunction, because in complex industrial environments, chance failures tend to be scattered, whereas damage concentrated in the most militarily relevant node carries different implications, especially given that such facilities require months, not days, to repair due to specialized equipment and environmental controls, meaning the true cost is measured less in visible damage than in lost production time that can ripple into ammunition shortages at the front, pressure that compounds existing strains as Russia reportedly seeks external munition sources. And alongside the strategic calculus, there is the civilian dimension, because residents in surrounding areas reported acrid chemical odors, burning sensations in eyes and throats, and breathing difficulties, experiences that collapse the psychological distance between the war and daily life, undermining an implicit social contract built on the promise that stability at home would be preserved regardless of events elsewhere, a promise further strained when, almost concurrently, a major transformer station fire in the Serpukhov area plunged neighborhoods into darkness and cut heating during sub-zero temperatures, conditions that turn infrastructure failure into an immediate threat rather than an inconvenience. And the location sharpened concern, because the facility sits only a few kilometers from an academy associated with Russia's strategic missile forces, making it difficult for observers to dismiss the incident as irrelevant to national security, even if civilians bore the initial impact. And taken together, these events form a pattern that resembles not conventional warfare, but a campaign of internal disruption aimed at systems rather than symbols, raising questions about whether loosely coordinated sabotage networks, partisan cells, or insider-enabled actions are exploiting vulnerabilities created by wartime strain, corruption, and overstretched security, because modern disruption does not require large explosions or spectacular destruction, only precise interference with function, whether through small devices, insider access, or targeted damage that renders key nodes inoperable, and this possibility gains weight when similar fires are reported far from the capital, including in Vladivostok on Russia's Pacific edge, where warehouses linked to logistics corridors burned with an intensity that drew attention precisely because of the city's role as a gateway for eastern supply routes, suggesting reach and coordination across thousands of kilometers rather than isolated mishap, and when viewed alongside reports of Ukrainian strikes on power plants and substations in border regions and occupied territories, the broader strategic picture comes into focus, one in which electricity, fuel, and industrial throughput become the true battlefield, because modern militaries depend on uninterrupted energy to move trains, operate radar, sustain command networks, and manufacture materiel. And when power falters, those systems degrade quietly but decisively, reshaping operational realities without dramatic troop movements. And inside Russia, the psychological effects may prove as consequential as the material ones, because winter magnifies every failure and each blackout, chemical scare, or unexplained fire chips away at the image of omnipotent control, fueling social media complaints and private doubts that official statements struggle to contain, eroding confidence not through a single collapse, but through repeated reminders of vulnerability, a dynamic that mirrors the hardship Ukraine has endured under bombardment, yet now appears to be reflecting back toward the aggressor's core, suggesting a reversal in the flow of fear. And while none of these incidents alone proves a coordinated campaign, together they raise an uncomfortable question for the Kremlin, whether a strategy designed to weaponize darkness against Ukraine has invited a response that targets the very systems meant to keep Russia insulated, shifting the conflict from front lines and borders into infrastructure and confidence itself. And as analysts continue to piece together intent, capability, and consequence, one conclusion is already emerging: that the war is no longer contained to geography or conventional battlefields, but is increasingly fought within networks, supply chains, and public perception, spaces where control is harder to assert and reassurance harder to sustain, leaving Russia, like Ukraine, confronting a winter in which power, stability, and certainty can no longer be taken for granted. From a risk assessment perspective, rather than a battlefield narrative, what is unfolding inside Russia reads less like a series of unrelated mishaps and more like stress fractures appearing in a system that was never designed to absorb sustained internal pressure during a prolonged war, because the Russian state has historically relied on the perception that control radiates outward from the capital, and that whatever instability exists will be contained at the edges. Yet the recent concentration of industrial accidents, fires, and power failures close to Moscow and across distant regions challenges that assumption and forces analysts to consider whether the Kremlin's own escalation strategy has exposed vulnerabilities it can no longer easily seal, particularly after Vladimir Putin doubled down on an energy war intended to exhaust Ukraine by systematically targeting electricity generation and distribution, a campaign framed domestically as decisive and externally as ruthless, but one that appears to have triggered a form of asymmetric response that does not mirror missile strikes city for city, instead exploiting the same logic of infrastructure dependence to create disruption where Russia is least comfortable acknowledging it, inside its own borders and near its most politically sensitive population centers. Because when a chemical plant supplying critical industrial inputs erupts in flames southeast of Moscow, or when a transformer station failure leaves entire communities without light and heat during extreme cold, the issue is no longer abstract geopolitics, but lived insecurity. And this is precisely where the Kremlin's narrative discipline faces its hardest test, as officials may label each event a coincidence, but coincidence becomes harder to sell when the incidents cluster around facilities with military relevance or strategic proximity, such as plants tied to ammunition supply chains or substations near institutions linked to nuclear command training. And while none of this confirms a centrally coordinated sabotage campaign, it does point to a convergence of motive and opportunity, because modern states at war stretch their internal systems thin, diverting resources to the front, relying on overworked infrastructure, and tolerating higher levels of corruption and complacency, conditions that make selective disruption easier whether through insider assistance, negligence exploited by hostile actors, or decentralized partisan activity. And the implications go beyond immediate damage, since the real strategic effect lies in uncertainty, forcing security services to spread attention inward, compelling authorities to reassure a population that has long been promised insulation from wartime hardship, and subtly shifting the psychological balance by demonstrating that the costs of escalation are not confined to distant territories, a shift reinforced by reports of similar fires and logistical disruptions thousands of kilometers away in the far east, where Russia's Pacific gateways handle supply flows critical to sustaining long campaigns, meaning that even localized incidents can cascade into broader logistical slowdowns that surface days or weeks later on the battlefield. And this dynamic mirrors the logic Russia itself applied when striking Ukrainian energy nodes, betting that cumulative strain would erode resilience. Yet resilience has proven stubborn, and now the same cumulative logic appears to be turning back toward Russian society, where each outage, unexplained fire, or chemical scare chips away at the core promise of stability that underpins political obedience, especially in winter, when infrastructure failures carry immediate human consequences. And this raises a deeper strategic dilemma for the Kremlin, because restoring control is not simply a matter of repairs or arrests, but of reasserting credibility, something far harder to achieve once doubt spreads through informal channels faster than official messaging. And in that sense, the current phase of the conflict suggests an evolution from kinetic confrontation to systemic contestation, where the decisive battles are fought not only with weapons, but with the integrity of networks that sustain modern life, leaving Russia confronting a reality it sought to impose on others, that in a war of infrastructure and endurance, no center is truly untouchable, and no guarantee of stability can remain absolute for long. Viewed through the lens of governance rather than military spectacle, the unfolding situation suggests that Russia is entering a phase where internal risk management is becoming as critical as battlefield maneuvering, because prolonged conflict has a way of converting external pressure into domestic fragility, and the Russian system, built on centralized authority and managed calm, is particularly exposed when disruptions become visible and frequent, especially after Vladimir Putin publicly committed the state to a strategy of escalation over compromise, a choice that signaled resolve abroad, but also locked the Kremlin into a high-stakes cycle where backing down becomes politically costly and pushing forward amplifies strain. And this strain is now manifesting not as open dissent or mass protest, but as a series of failures that undermine the aura of competence on which the regime relies. Because when fires break out at industrial facilities, when power stations fail during extreme cold, and when officials respond with vague explanations rather than transparent detail, the gap between official messaging and lived experience widens, particularly around Moscow, where the social contract has long been defined by predictability and protection from chaos. And this is where the current pattern matters more than any single incident, since systems analysts note that modern states rarely collapse from one dramatic blow, but instead erode through accumulated inefficiencies and credibility losses, each one manageable in isolation, yet corrosive in combination. And in wartime, those inefficiencies multiply as resources are diverted outward, maintenance cycles are deferred, skilled labor is pulled into other roles, and oversight weakens, creating an environment where accidents become more likely and hostile interference becomes easier to conceal within the noise of dysfunction. And while Russian authorities emphasize continuity and resilience, the very need to repeatedly reassure the public about safety, power supply, and environmental risks indicates that reassurance itself has become a scarce commodity, because confidence, once shaken, does not reset with official statements. It recalibrates based on patterns people can observe, such as whether outages recur, whether smells linger in the air, whether repairs are rapid or prolonged, and whether explanations change over time. And this recalibration has strategic implications, since a population that begins to internalize uncertainty becomes harder to mobilize psychologically for a long war, even if overt opposition remains limited. And this is compounded by the geographic spread of recent disruptions, which stretches the narrative of localized mishap beyond plausibility and hints at a state struggling to monitor and secure a vast internal landscape under stress, a challenge that intensifies when the war economy demands uninterrupted flows of energy, chemicals, transport, and labor, all of which depend on infrastructure that was designed for peacetime efficiency rather than sustained contestation. And from this perspective, the true vulnerability exposed is not any single factory or substation, but the assumption that internal order can be indefinitely preserved while external pressure is maximized, an assumption that history repeatedly undermines. Because as the conflict grinds on, the Kremlin faces a narrowing set of options: either tighten control at increasing economic and social cost, or accept a degree of internal instability that chips away at the very stability it claims to defend. And in that tension lies the deeper story emerging from the smoke and darkness, not simply one of retaliation or sabotage, but of a system discovering the limits of its own insulation in a war that increasingly refuses to stay at the margins.